I'd like to start off by 3 acknowledgements. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge all of you. Now, each and every one of you here is a leader in your own right. I'd like to acknowledge the excellence that you've displayed. Each of you has your own story, your own successes, your own flaws, just like I do. Your own story, specifically. So I want to acknowledge all of the leaders in this room. Thank you for being here. The fact that you're here is an acknowledgement that you want to learn and you're engaged with that journey of learning. I also want to acknowledge the fact that here in Sri Lanka, we have a magnificent legacy of leadership. We don't really need to be taught too much about leadership if you just go back in our history. It runs in our veins. I'm not sure how many of you know this, but Sri Lanka has the highest density of World Heritage Sites in all of the world. I think we have something like 8. Divide that by 65,610 square kilometers, and that will give you the highest density of World Heritage Sites. In fact, the last one to be declared by the United Nations was when our irrigation systems were named as a World Water Heritage. So it's an incredible country, and we often go to Steve Jobs and Bill Gates to learn about leadership, but I also like to urge you to read the 550 Jataka Katava, the 550 Jataka stories, the Panchatantra, to unlock incredible lessons in wisdom and leadership. 3 other people, Mr. Tom Friedman, the famous author, Mr. Giddy Greenstein, a futurist, and Mr. David Holland, a man who's reimagining the way HP thinks about education. I reached out to these 3 gentlemen, whom I know personally, to run by some of the thoughts I wanted to share with you today, and I'd like to acknowledge their contribution in what I have to say to you today. You see, when you talk about leadership, we need to think about the future. Leadership is all about creating the future. Let's think about it in terms of 3 boxes: the past, the present, and the future. For the most part, and I'm guilty of this as well, we spend the vast majority of our time as leaders thinking about the present. Maybe 75% of the time we're firefighting and thinking about things that we need to do here and now. But leadership is about creating the future. And if you don't have some sort of opinion of the future, how are you going to create it? How are you going to lead your team? How are you going to lead people? So it's critically important that we spend a lot of time trying to understand the future of leadership. And as a result of that, leadership of the future. How will the characteristics that we talk about so often, resilience, strength, courage, intelligence, how will all of these hows and whats change based on the changing nature of leadership itself? In order for us to understand what kind of future we're headed towards, we need to also take into account the fact that politics, industry, globalization, business, all of these things are melding together and converging and changing at a pace that is difficult for us to understand. So let's try to make sense of this speed of change, because unless you understand the future you're heading towards, you can't possibly remain relevant as a leader. And it is a journey of learning, there's no doubt about that. You see, Thomas Friedman speaks about this guy who is the CEO of Google X, and Astra Teller is his name. So Astra Teller speaks about the age of acceleration. And the reason I'm speaking to you about this, and I'm bringing out this example to you today, is so that it helps us make sense of what the future holds. Astra Teller speaks of this famous graph. Now, if you think of a graph and think of one line shaped kind of like a hockey stick, there's incremental growth, and then suddenly there's almost a vertical growth in that line. That vertical growth, and that line, in fact, is the speed and the rate of change in technology. If you think about it 100 or 200 years ago, technology, yes, it changed and improved, but the speed at which it changed was much slower than it is today. And it has impacted every sphere of technology, every part of our lives. Think about transport. It took years, maybe 50 years, for us to go from propeller aircraft to jet engines. And that shift completely changed the way we travel around the world. But today, the change that we saw last week is obsolete today. This is the age of acceleration. Everything is changing. AstroTeller speaks of a second line on his graph, and that is the human ability to adapt to that technological shift. And that line, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, just kind of creeps around like a worm. There's incremental growth. We adapt, but certainly not as fast as technology changes. So what we have today is a moment in time where technology is taking that vertical leap. And the reason is innovation is feeding on innovation. We see it everywhere. Innovation is feeding on innovation, and that's causing technology to just leap up into the air, and our ability, our very human ability to contend with that change is struggling. We're falling behind. And you can see that in business, in politics, in governance, in just about everything. So as leaders, it's very important to understand this future, because there are certain things we need to do today in order to remain relevant in the next 5 to 10 years. We react to things we can see. If I were to tell you that there is a storm right outside of this hotel, and it's going to destroy this hotel, what would all of you do? You'd run away. You'd escape. We're programmed to react to things we can touch and see and feel and sense. But what about the things that we can't see? See, as a leader, part of your job is to bend light just a bit. You have to be able to see around the corner. And to be able to do that, you need a mirror to deflect that light, to reflect the light around the corner. And that mirror is a reflection of where you stand right now. And when you look at yourself, and when you assess yourself, and how ready and prepared you are as a leader to understand what's around the corner, there are a couple of areas which you need to be aware of. Let's talk about technology. I'm a huge fan of technology, in particular, artificial intelligence and robotics. Now, these are buzzwords, aren't they? Everyone's talking about it. There are a dime a dozen conferences around the world on artificial intelligence and robotics. But I've been privileged and blessed to spend some time with some of the world's leading companies trying to understand what on earth is going on here. And I can tell you that the stuff that's happening in these two spheres is going to change everything. Just last week, I spent some time with an Australian company in Perth, and the company is called Fast Brick Robotics. These guys have put together a contraption that builds a brick, and then it has a robotic arm that places the brick, uses a solvent, and then builds walls, and it can complete a home in which a family can live in a day. No human intervention, just one guy driving the truck. Can you imagine how this is going to change the way our homes are built? This is not something that we see in a science lab or a science exhibition. This is real. Very serious people have put in millions of dollars behind these ideas because they're convinced that they will work. If you think about artificial intelligence, can you imagine deep learning machines that can understand patterns taking the place of the doctors that we go to? Just yesterday I read an article about how certain artificial intelligence programs can predict certain diseases far better than any doctor, a doctor with 40 or 50 years of experience. Certainly, I wouldn't recommend any of you to depend on an AI program today. But as deep learning keeps learning, it's going to come to a point where we'll all be controlled and taken care of by artificial intelligence. That is a certainty. If that is our reality, if that is the future that we're headed towards, shouldn't we as leaders prepare for the dynamic variables that we're going to encounter over the next 5 to 10 years? Even how we come up with ideas and solutions is changing. I'm going to give you one example. There's crowdsourced innovation. It's called open innovation. And one of the cool things about open innovation is that anybody, anywhere, can contribute. Recently, NASA was faced with a big challenge. It needed to predict solar storms. Now, a solar storm is a storm that travels at 3 million miles per hour. And if you want to fly around in the solar system, I think it's a good idea to be able to predict this stuff. Okay, so NASA needed a solution. And their best scientists, huddled up in a little room, spending 3 or 4 years, were able to predict a solar storm in 2 hours at an accuracy of 50%. They opened this whole problem out. And some guy, a semi-retired engineer in New Hampshire, came up with an algorithm that predicted a solar storm 8 hours before it happened with a 75% degree of accuracy. That's what's amazing about open innovation. And the technological platforms that we have today is going to make all of this possible. So the democratization of technology, of leadership, crowdsourcing leadership is going to be the norm rather than the exception. Now, it's impossible for us to consider the future of leadership without talking about governance, because that's what drives all of us forward, is it not? Think about demographics, for instance. How will our societies change? The customers that we serve, the products that we build, how will they change? And how can we then change ourselves today to face that reality? So we're going to have kind of a population that looks like this, where an upside-down pyramid, where the top of the pyramid is going to be lots of old people, supported by a lot fewer young people. Now, politics needs to understand this and think of this. So bringing in women into the workforce, people who are not participating as much as they should currently, is critically important for us to be able to support this structure. World demographics is changing, and understanding this is a key point. If you think about politics itself, not party politics, but politics all around the world, we have a system that's essentially created post-World War II. In Sri Lanka, the two parties were created in the 1950s. What was the world like in 1950? Think about it. It had just seen off a world war. And then in the 60s, we had the Cold War. And then in the 80s, we had the fall of the Soviet Union. And essentially, you had two parties that represented two ideologies that were born post-Cold War. This is 2019. The stuff that I've been talking to you about for the past 10 or 15 minutes is not at all connected and engaged to the parties that we see, not just in Sri Lanka, but all around the world, which is why you're seeing tectonic shifts in the kind of people who are elected in other nations. Political systems aren't able to contend and deal with this age of change and acceleration. When you talk about governance, why it's critically important is, as leaders here in Sri Lanka, we need to understand the real challenges that we face in this country. And one of the challenges is obviously poverty. But the real challenge we have in Sri Lanka, more than poverty, is inequality. If you think about our average household income, it's about 60,000, I guess between 60 and 70,000 rupees. That's pretty good. That's pretty decent. But if you dive a little deeper, you're going to find out that the majority of Sri Lankan households survive on less than half of that. Leadership isn't easy. It's tough. It's a choice. You get criticized, you get whacked, you fail. You have to drag yourself on some days. And it is absolutely thankless. But I can tell you that these challenges need leaders who care, not leaders who stand up and just speak about the problems, who acknowledge the problems, but leaders who are willing to think prudently and spend time acquiring wisdom to make the right decisions so that this nation can ultimately prosper. We need our people. You see, we can't leave anyone behind. We need all of our people, the people we agree with and disagree with, the rich, the poor, everybody in all 25 districts in this nation. We need our people in the transformation of our land. And I can tell you, because I spend a lot of time traveling from village to village in Sri Lanka, our people need you. They need your leadership. Let's be the world's most competitive nation when it comes to the SDGs. Let's lead like we did thousands of years ago. And we can do it because it is a commitment that we made to the rest of the world. We can't just ignore it and pretend it never happened. I'm sure you've heard the words resilience and courage and ambition and drive. These are very, very important to a leader. But how are these characteristics going to transform themselves to face a new reality? I'll give you one example. If you talk about resilience, resilience used to mean being able to see through a bad time. Resilience used to mean being able to have patience until the good time came along. Well, some of you might have careers that span 10, 20, 30 years. You must have invested your entire lives into building what you can very rightly be proud of. You're a tough guy or a girl. You have a ton of achievements under your belt, and you're an excellent leader. And some kid sitting in his room tweets and questions your leadership. Now, as Churchill said, when walking towards a destination, you can't stop to chuck a rock at every dog that barks. But in this day and age, you also need to be quite aware of why the dog is barking. You can't just ignore the barking dogs because it's part of our new reality. So if you like it or not, your leadership, your achievement, your ambition, your drive will be questioned. How do you deal with that stuff? Do you just ignore it? Or do you engage with it? As somebody in the media, I can tell you that I am on the forefront of dealing with such criticism. But some of the doctors and lawyers and engineers amongst you might think, you know what, this doesn't interest or involve me. I can tell you this, it's coming. This new reality is coming, and immediate feedback, immediate reaction to whatever you do, to your leadership, is a new reality that you're going to have to contend with. I believe that the future will raise leaders who have the prudence to understand this reality. I believe that the future will raise leaders just like you to be able to lead not just your teams or your companies or your families, but lead this nation, not just to survive, but to prosper like we did Matthew spent a whole lot of time in the first chapter explaining and describing Jesus' genealogy, his lineage. Why? Because it's important to know where he came from. And today I'd like to remind you, every Sri Lankan sitting here, know who you are and where you came from. Know what runs in your veins. Know how blessed you are to be born in this land. And you will be raised to lead this nation to prosperity. We are second to none, and that's what we need to be very proud of. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude with a quote that I love from the Talmud, and it goes something like this: what comes from the heart goes to the heart. I've spoken from the heart, the lessons and the stories and the experiences of some kid who did really nothing much at St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia, and was given a little opportunity. And I've had a wonderful journey for the past 20 years. And all of these thoughts that I've thrown out at you come from the heart. And I sincerely hope that it touches yours. Thank you.